Welcome. I will speak English for the remaining part of the conference. I would like to welcome you all for our third keynote, which will be held by Susana Muhamad, former Minister of Environment and Sustainable Development of Colombia. Susana, very honored to have you with us. Just to introduce you shortly, you studied political science and you earned a master's degree in sustainable development. That you did in South Africa. And you actually started to work in the environmental department at Shell Global Solutions International in The Hague. But when Shell decided to invest in fracking, you decided this is the time to leave the company. And you returned to Colombia. And during Gustavo Petro's period as mayor of Bogota in 2012, Gustavo Petro now is the president of Colombia, but when he was the mayor, you were appointed Secretary of the Environment. And a year later, you became the Secretary General of the Mayor's Office. Then you were elected as Councilor of Bogota, which you remained until the first half of 2022. And then you joined Gustavo Petro's government as Colombia's environment minister from 2022 to 2025. And I met you in that time, and I think your major achievement was the reduction of deforestation rates in the Colombian Amazon region, but also that you managed to bring the COP16 biodiversity conference held in Cali to a success in the end. You didn't give up when time had run up in Cali, and you reconvened in Rome, and you managed this very important step of the international community to invest in protecting the world's ecosystems so that human life on Earth is possible. And so I think that nobody of you will be very much surprised to hear that the focus you will now put on our analysis of what security is about and peace, on the dimension of peace with nature. So Susana, please come up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to start this conference first thanking the Heinrich-Böll Foundation for inviting me. It's a pleasure and an honor for me to be here, and also for the great partnership that we created in Colombia, which always was in the work with the grassroots, with the people. And when we are talking about the objectives of our societies, we have to think in this very convoluted world, what is all this system for? For whom? For what? An economic system and process of industrialization that right now puts human life as a species at risk in the planet. More than 4,300 million years of Earth's evolution. In the next geological phase, coming from 200 years of industrialization, in what some authors are right now calling fossil fuel capitalism. And what is the current result of that system? If we measure it in terms of economic wealth, it has created huge amounts of wealth. But at the same time, it has transformed the biosphere, the living planet, into inert matter, into death matter, at a rate that the whole Earth system cannot regenerate itself on its own at the level of extractivism and materialism of a system of production and consumption which has not created for huge amounts of humankind well-being. And how we measure well-being, or how we define it more than measure it, has to do, for example, with the capacities to satisfy basic needs. So we have probably increased that immensely in the last decades, but at the risk of not being able to fulfill that for next generations. We have been able to advance immensely in technology, but also creating a huge inequality where actually 10% of the global population, 800 million people, do not have even access to basic needs in this very wealthy world. But also 1% concentrates, 1% of the population concentrates 80% of the wealth. So for whom and for what is this system of production and consumption for? At the risk of the living capacity of the generations that were already and are being born in this 21st century. If that tension is not a tension that creates conflict, I don't know what else will be the final chord for harvesting conflict permanently. And part of that puts humanity into a mission. The problem is that that mission requires a process of global consensus, a process of global involvement, because nobody within the current system of nation states, no single state, nation state, can solve that crisis in the long term alone. I cannot protect my population from the effects that climate change, loss of biodiversity, and global pollution are having in my population by the action only of my population. We just had 1 year of water shortage in Bogota, a region of 10 million people. 10 million people in Bogota, the most developed, with the highest GDP, the most educated, the engine, probably 20% of the GDP of the country, didn't have water for a day every week for a year. Not because we didn't have the technology to get water, not because we didn't have the infrastructure, because simply we didn't have the water. And when a government starts facing that potential situation, how do you deal with the tensions it creates? We are having also in some of the most biodiverse areas in the country, some of the broader challenges of security. And it seems to be that there is a contradiction, and I will talk a little bit about that. So the issue is that with a system of permanent economic growth that requires permanent extraction of resources, these resources are getting more scarce as well, and more difficult and expensive to extract, from oil to minerals to whatever you require for this industrialized society. So a critical question, and now we have these environmental conventions where we as countries and more or less humanity have said, let's address this global problem. But the problem is we don't address the problem, we just address the consequence of the problem. So in the climate convention, we are addressing emissions. But we don't want to face what it means to phase out production of fossil fuels. In the biodiversity conference, we try to safeguard some protected areas, ecosystems, but we don't face the system of production and consumption that creates the pollution. Although I will say that the Kunming-Montreal Agreement is one of the most comprehensive agreements to try to tackle in a more systemic way the process. And on the other side, on the economic agreements internationally, what we have fostered is actually going deeper into the global liberal capitalistic system, based on the globalization of the economy, where actually rather than creating the securities for life for people, we have decided that society, rules, governance, labor rights, environment, social issues should be at the service of free trade agreements. This means that it's more important in the system the global trade and thinking about our global world as a market rather than thinking about human well-being and human development. The consequence of that globalization is that actually the environmental crisis, which is not an environmental crisis, as if there is something called environment outside of who we are, but actually life on this earth has been sacrificed in the name of the market. And has been sacrificed because it's the last 40 years where actually we have seen the deepening of the crisis to go for a goal that we have called development, which again brings the question, development for whom and for what? In the process, we have destroyed ecosystems, but it's not only ecosystems, again, as if they are outside us. The diversity of life has also created the diversity of culture, the diversity of cultures, and the diversity of human knowledge of how to live in this earth. Millennia of human experience of adapting to the environment, of transforming the environment, which is actually more or less what the human species seems to be part of its DNA, transform the environment, but in a way that actually sustains life and its own life. But these 200 years of industrialization and fossil fuel economies have actually destroyed the very much matter of life. So we simultaneously, in this 21st century, are at the same time at the ecological limits of the planet, with this machinery of extraction of resources. Actually, even we have conceptualized people as a resource. So we talk human resources. We don't talk about cultures. We don't talk about people. We talk about resource. Nature as a resource, people as a resource for this big industrial machinery for development, which we already saw is totally unequal. So we are at that point, that tipping point, where actually we have deregulated the forces of nature on Earth. And that is coming as like a boomerang back to us in terms of nature's deregulation. And the effects it's having on societies, on economies. Because what economy are we going to have if we don't have any planet left? And so that is what we see now as the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, and more or less we're feeling the effects in different parts of the world. The effects could be so dramatic that it destabilizes the fabric of society, because even with this fiction that the industrial machinery that gives us our basic needs every day is what gives us life, that machinery relies on ecosystems and relies on nature and relies on a planet with a certain functioning to function as well. Since we have become separated and life is being deregulated, that is affecting also the machinery, and then the governance of the crisis becomes much more difficult. And so there has been a push for change since the 70s. It has grown up, it has created the conventions, has created the global agreements, but we never put into question that is the fossil fuel-driven capitalist economic growth that is at the heart of the crisis. So we keep talking about goals that we won't fulfill because we don't want politically to shift the system. And it's not because we don't have the capacity to do so, to imagine a world where this extraction of resources at this level can be achieved, but it's because there is vested powers that actually are resisting. The worst image of those vested powers is the current government of the United States, where actually is not only vested interest of the fossil fuel industry, vested interest of the machinery, the economic machinery, which of course creates power for some and disempower millions, billions of people. Actually, when we see the scale of values, we think in this logic that the 65 different people, so only in the Colombian Amazons, where we have 65 different languages of cultural evolution towards centennial, is less worthy than citizens that live in the industrialized world. There's a ranking. They have less power than the fossil fuel industry. But actually, they are the key to the sustenance of all humanity. So we don't want to put, we don't want, the invested system doesn't want to see that. Now, the problem is that I have seen in this decade of the 20s, in the third decade of this century, decade of this century, actually the third one, we already have it, that the struggle has become very acute. So to sustain the system, you have to go further for resources. We don't have anymore the cheap oil. We don't have the cheap minerals. You don't have colonial powers that can go and slave the people, take the resources. Then we created this, after World War II, system, economic system that is very colonial still. Now all these agreements, still the power structure is there for some countries to put resources and import technology. And this is how rich societies keep rich and underdeveloped countries keep underdeveloped. But this is not a faith or a destiny or that we are less people. This is a system of power. And so we have rebelled to that system many times. In my country, it took 60 years of warfare, internal conflict. And right now, after the peace process, finally we are starting to do the land reform. But it has been part of the struggle. Now, the issue is that it's becoming more acute because, and this is a thesis, a hypothesis, it seems that the regime of power, when the world, the societies, the people starts moving towards how we can create more regenerative societies, when millions of students in Europe go marching for climate change shift, when the people in different parts of the world start mobilizing, when the global agreements start moving forward, then we have a backlash in our political system. And the issue is that there are authoritarian regimes that are coming, especially what's happening in the United States, which agenda is actually to defend their privilege and defend the fossil fuel capital. And it seems to be that in that defense, they are willing to use authoritarianism. It seems to be that authoritarianism is a way to keep.
Es ist eine Möglichkeit, das Kapitalsystem basierend auf fossilen Brennstoffen weiterzuführen und das im Lichte des Klimawandels. Und das ist die Frage, die die Sicherheitsspannungen verursacht. Wo sind die Ressourcen? Wer hat sie und wer verwaltet sie? Wie können wir sicherstellen für die Reichen und für das System, dass diese Ressourcen reproduziert werden? Und das ist ein Backlash auf einen potenziellen Wandel. Das heißt, solche westlichen Demokratien helfen dabei also nicht. Sie wollen ihre Ziele einfach weiterhin verfolgen. Und es verbleibt eben die Frage, können wir einen demokratischen Wandel schaffen, weg von kapitalistischen fossilen Wirtschaften, um die Menschheit zu retten letzten Endes und das ohne Konflikte. Es gibt die Erfahrungen der Menschen im globalen Süden. Und was können wir uns vorstellen als Gemeinschaft, dass man den Frieden mit der Natur ins Zentrum stellt, und zwar so, dass man die Klimakrise umkehrt. Das heißt, indem man auch die Art und Weise, wie man die Gesellschaft sieht, verändert. Nämlich, es geht hier nicht um die Reproduktion von Kapital. Es geht ja nicht um menschliches Wohlergehen, sondern die Reproduktion von Kapital. Aber wie können wir das schaffen, damit das Wohlergehen der Menschheit im Zentrum steht?
And when we talk about peace with nature, we actually were able to capture the imagination of the population. At least in Colombia, a very immense ecological and cultural diverse country. People resounded with this because they felt represented. They felt they could express themselves because they are part of territories where they have lived for many years, decades, centuries, that is part of who they are. Nature is part of who they are. And we also discover that beyond the climate crisis and the climate protest, where you talk about molecules and CO2, nature became an inspiring process of mobilization. Because everybody in the world, even if through artificial means, everybody, as humans, we have a connection with a river, with a mountain, with the tree in front of our house, with the birds. It's part of who we are. And if we could touch that fiber that brings people not in a system as a resource, but actually uplift the recognition of who we are as humans in our cultural context. We put culture at the center. We put our territories at the center, and we put well-being at the center of the system. Could we generate a way of living which does not exclude having an economy that actually restores nature systematically and help us transcend the climate crisis? So imagining all processes of society as a life regeneration machine or life regeneration engine. What we have now is a destruction of life economic engine. Is the concrete systematic result of our system. We could talk about mitigation. We could talk about new technology, and that's where the technology fiction comes. That we could solve this technologically, that we can capture the CO2, that we need to develop the technologies and we will be fine. We cannot replace 4,500 years, million years of Earth's wisdom and evolution. What we can do is try to reconnect ourselves to the cycles of nature. And from a country that is still wealthy, very wealthy in natural diversity, in biodiversity, very wealthy in cultural diversity, where people actually are very resilient because they have to live every day, but they do live, and they do live with a lot of happiness, actually, because you enjoy your culture, because you are with others, because you build community, because you are resilient in good and in bad, because you still have faith. And you have faith in life. And life is a process of enjoying, not a process of accumulating. I see a big opportunity. But I see that opportunity also in the whole of South America. I could see that opportunity in parts of Africa. I could see that opportunity, but that will need to be seen in a different global regime. Because if the global regime keeps seeing us as a source of resources, as the government of Trump told us, they don't see us as the Colombian people, and Colombia is an abstraction. There is thousands of cultures within Colombia. Colombia is just an abstraction. Colombia has at least 5 nations within one territory, one nation state. But it's at least 5 nations, and within each one of them is whole of diversity. So no, they see us as the minerals for the energy transition. They are not mobilizing the largest military operation in 60 years to Latin America, including submarines with missiles, nuclear missiles, to the Caribbean coast in front of Venezuela to deal with some drug dealers. I don't believe they will put that cost of mobilization of military into the Venezuelan coast, as they say, because of the drugs, the war against drugs. They want the petroleum and the fossil fuel, the petroleum of Venezuela. They want the oil of Venezuela. And probably they like the minerals of Colombia as well, in the most biodiversity hotspots. So, of course, if we could have a force, and I will finish with this because this is just to put it forward. And by the way, we are seeing from the south what's happening in Palestine. And we are seeing the genocide, and we are noticing that this is an example that could happen to any of us. Because if nobody could stop that, and actually, as the Albanese report shows, there's a lot of people profiting from that. Technology, our military industry, technological experiments, all type of industries around the developed world. Then if they want our minerals, they want our oil, any type of conflict can start, and we don't have any defense. The Colombian army is very good into counter-insurgency, but we have no idea about all these sophisticated weapons and all of these things. So we have to build, or no, we have to build. I think there is a potential to build a force of people. I agree very much with what has been said during the whole conference about putting people at the center, and that's why I believe that this transition, which is very hard, very dynamic, could work better in democratic systems, because putting nature and people at the center with cultural diversity could create a process. It is not a coincidence that the people that have mobilized to try to stop the genocide in Gaza, actually from 44 countries, and that are trying to take humanitarian aid to Gaza through the flotilla, are environmentalists, many of them. It's not a coincidence. It's because there is the understanding that this struggle between fossil capitalism and the potential to transcend to another way of living in this planet is a political struggle and is a power struggle with very sophisticated arms. So in Colombia, we could imagine, because I saw it, we have all the elements, but we need the global enabling environment, which is now not very satisfying. We could see how we can create new industries, new economic sectors, restore nature, work with our culture, give the world what the world is needing: health, water, food, nutritious food. This is what the world needs in the 21st century. We have called it climate security and protection. It means that we can guarantee, even with the climate crisis, always our population will have water, always with our population will have food sovereignty, always our population will have health access, will have energy sovereignty, and will be protected from disasters. And for us, this is the basic human security in the 21st century. From there, and in a synergistic way, we can create economies for life. This means economies that systematically guarantee this climate security and protection. Economies that reinforce the possibility that our population will always have water, will always have food, will always have health, will always have energy, and will be protected of disasters. If there is economies that erode the climate security and protection, these are economies that are not useful for humanity well-being. On the contrary, they are economies that put people in insecurity and that could create all type of conflicts. So, as Zizek says, I hope from the Greens, from the progressives, from the people, rather than buying the military logic of the military industry, which at the end is an economic strategy, so we buy more weapons so that they produce more money. We could create a path for the restoration of humanity, of the planet and nature, that I think creates the resilience, the society links, the recognition of the diversity of who we are, and the values that could sustain us in this transition in the 21st century, rather than going into a chaos of war and insecurity, which we are reproducing with this power structure. But that is not an ideology, it's not a dream, it's a struggle. And it is a political struggle, and it has to start with the people. 2 examples. Why Colombia has hosted the Palestine conference, diplomatic conference, with South Africa. Why only 13 countries signed, although 31 countries came to observe. Why Colombia next year is going to host a diplomatic conference on the non-proliferation of fossil fuel treaty. Because we know that our survival and our possibility and our gift to humanity depends on transcending this system. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Susana. I think that this was a very fundamental approach to what creates insecurity and how the transition which all of us imagine for a society and an economy in peace with nature has many resistances to face. And I think it matches very well with the report you're going to introduce us to. So I would invite my panelists to come up here. Please join me. Please come, and I will introduce you once you are seated. You can choose freely where you want to sit. Ambassador, come here. So our panel will deal with defending disarmament, which is a very it's untimely question, it seems, to speak about. Sorry, I'm having to meddle with my papers. Because we have talked about during the day about the trinity or the tensions actually between peace, security, and freedom, and its intersections, its delimitations and tensions. And with your speech now, Susana, we have learned about the forces of resistance in a situation where we seem to be at a breaking point in many aspects. We have talked about humanitarian law and international law being questioned, about democracy being questioned, about the multilateral system being questioned, and it's the multilateral system which has given us the climate treaty. It has given us the biodiversity treaty, but also rules to follow in order to preserve peace, and also some aspects how to deal with questions of social justice, which we know is crucial for maintaining or achieving peace within society and across societies. So your speech, Susana, reminded us that the heart of the Green Movement, there is not only striving to achieve peace with nature, but also when I was young, the peace movement was a very important space for those who later on started to vote for the Green Party. And I don't think that all of them were actually totally convinced pacifists, but they were absolutely convinced that having such a big amount of nuclear arms on the world is a deep danger. And it's the danger of not being able to control certain dynamics, which then could lead to nuclear war happening. And I don't think that these two processes are disconnected, actually, because they speak about it, they propose a different basis for societies to relate within each other, to each other, and also with the surrounding, or not surrounding world, but with nature, which is part of us as well. So, I welcome you all now. Thank you very much for being with us. And I would first introduce you. So, we have with us Izumi Nakamitsu, UN Under-Secretary General and High Representative for Disarmament Affairs. You are a Japanese diplomat, and you are Under-Secretary General since 2017. And before that, you were Assistant Secretary General and Head of the Crisis Response Unit at the United Nations Development Programme at UNDP. And you have, in your previous career stages in the UN, you were, for example, Director in the Department of Peacekeeping Operations. And you have also worked at the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, IDEA, in Stockholm. And you are also a lecturer in Japan. So thank you very much for being here with us. Then we have Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins. You are a former US Under-Secretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. And you're also a visiting professor of international affairs. You have also a long career behind you. You were Presidential Management Fellow, and you worked at various roles at the US Department of Defense and at the Office of Management and Budget. And you were, for many years, a legal advisor at the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. And you participated in negotiations on disarmament and non-proliferation treaties. And during the Obama administration, you coordinated threat reduction programs at the Bureau of International Security and Non-Proliferation as US Ambassador, and you keep the title since. And under President Biden, you were Under-Secretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. And I would also like to mention that you founded the nonprofit Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security organization to advance the leadership and professional development of women of color in the fields of international peace and security and conflict transformation. And I think that's important to us also as working very much with civil society. So thank you also for that. Then we come to Murithi Mutiga. You are Program Director for Africa at the International Crisis Group. And I think I have listened to your analysis at one of our African regional planning conferences. So thank you very much also for that cooperation. You are a Program Director. As I said, you're based in Nairobi. Before, you headed the Crisis Group's Horn of Africa project. And before that, you reported on East Africa for The Guardian, so you are also an experienced journalist, which I think is very important for being able to communicate what actually crisis analysis shows to us. And we have heard in these previous sessions how important communication actually is for having a clear view of what is ahead of us. And finally, I would like to welcome Susanne Riegraf. Deputy Commissioner for Arms Control, Non-Proliferation and Disarmament from the German Federal Foreign Office in Berlin. You have been a Deputy Federal Government Commissioner since 2022. Before that, you worked as a head of division for transatlantic relations and the G7, and you also worked with the European External Action Service. And yeah, please applaud now. And then finally, we have Eunjung Lim, the professor at the Division of International Studies at Kongju National University in South Korea. And you are a member of the governing board of the Asia-Pacific Leadership Network for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. So we are very happy to count on your expertise here as well. So now I have to get my other papers. So I would like to invite you, Izumi, to share with us the key findings of the recent report by the UN Secretary General Guterres entitled "The Security We Need." And one topic there is the true cost of war. So does increasing military spending truly guarantee security? So please enlighten us about the main messages.
Thank you very much. Before I present some of the key findings, I just wanted to start by saying, I usually don't sit through conferences and discussions. Today I did, because I have been fascinated by the level of and the nature of discussions that have been taking place. In some senses, intrigued, but fascinating conversations. And one thing that I am very happy about is that your discussions related to security has been multidimensional. And that goes very much straight into the core part of the Secretary General's report on military expenditure. Now, two things I wanted to actually put to you because they relate to how you might understand the military expenditure report. The first thing, we need to really understand that the world is going through a profound transformation, a paradigm shift. It's not, and I can tell you, it did not start with the Russian invasion of Ukraine against international law. It had been going on for a couple of years. Many different aspects of it. Of course, the geopolitics, massive light speed, we say, advancement of technology. That last session talked about misinformation, disinformation, but there is more to it, right? Some of the technologies will be, and we are already beginning to see a weaponization of those technologies. That's going to change everything, including the way in which we fight wars that is happening in front of us. Geopolitics, it's not just about big military powers tensions, competitions. As part of our reality of the new world order, if you will, there is the global south. We need to remember that in terms of economy, population, demography, and everything, we are really now truly getting into a multipolar world. So it's not going to be as simple as what we have known until today. If we want to restore international order on the basis of international law, which we all want, obviously, then we need to have at least vast majority of the world, the UN member states, including, and importantly, the Global South, we need to have them on board. We need to work with them because they are now key part of our international order as well. What does that mean? That would mean that everything that we have been talking about, international law, including IHL, international humanitarian law, all these things, norms related to how international communities is governed, they need to apply across the board. No double standards. This is really important if we really want to restore international order on the basis of law, so-called rule-based order. They also, and then this, thank you. Also, one thing that goes directly to the military expenditure report is that there is more to military sense of security. Development, inequality, climate crisis that we just heard, all these things actually are major or key priority agenda of the international community at the global level. And we need to make sure that they will be addressed as well. Second thing I wanted to say, if you hear the word disarmament, you might actually think that we are advocating for reduction of armament. That is included, of course, but the UN defines disarmament more broadly. The disarmament toolbox includes things like risk reduction, transparency, confidence-building measures, arms control, non-proliferation, and of course, disarmament, reduction of armament. So all these are, if you can see, actually security instruments. Disarmament is not some sort of an idealistic argument, ignoring the realities around the world, but the international community has been developing those security instruments in the disarmament toolbox. So why not we utilize those instruments that are available to us in combination with appropriate defense military measures as well. So that sets sort of like conditions upon which the Secretary General launched this report. By the way, this report was mandated by UN member states by consensus last year. Exactly a year ago, there was a Pact for the Future that was adopted by consensus by all UN member states. And in that Pact for the Future, member states requested the Secretary General to put together an analytical report on the impact of rising military expenditures on sustainable development goals. Why did this happen? Precisely because vast majority of member states felt already last year, yes, that the current trajectory of military expenditure really skyrocketing is not sustainable. So in terms of the last year's figure, $2.7 trillion, with the current pace, military expenditure could rise by 2035 to $6.7 trillion. And this is obviously a record high in our history. All regions, this report is global, all regions are actually increasing military expenditure. It's not targeting any one region or one country. However, top 10 military spenders account for 78% of military expenditure. Now, looking at the Sustainable Development Goal side, already only 1 in 5 SDG goals are on track to be achieved by 2030. The financing gap for SDGs exceed $4 trillion. With the current rate, the gap could actually reach by 2030 $6.4 trillion. Now, do we think this current picture is making the world a safer, more secure place? Our conclusion was no. Why? Because various investments related to SDGs, education, healthcare, environment actions, climate actions, all these things are being crowded out. When these things, crowding out of resources, happen in the low-income countries, there is already a direct impact. Also against the background is a shrinking ODA, Official Development Corporation, as well. even in high-income countries, crowding out, let's say, 1% increase in military budget in high-income countries actually reduce social investment, the education, etc., by about 0.6% as well. So because of the prioritization of military investment, necessary, essential budget allocations for our well-being. Many people said that people have to be at the center of security. All these resources are now being shrunk. And this will have an impact of further destabilization of environment and society, and that will have obviously direct impact also to safety and security. So this is the finding of the Secretary General's report. I encourage you to read it. By the way, I would just like to end by saying that the report acknowledges and recognizes legitimate security concerns. What we are arguing is that the current imbalance of only looking at security by military means is not going to work. So we need to have a better balance in social spendings and military spending. And we want to make sure that this report will be a beginning of a conversation, what might be the right balance in these areas. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we have heard echoes of that actually in previous rounds. And when I look at our budget negotiation processes here in Germany, they also reflect, and the public debate about that also reflects the points you were making of having increased military spending, which is necessary, as we have heard here during the morning, but out of balance actually with other societal needs. So let me come to you, Ambassador Jenkins. I would like to shift the focus slightly from disarmament in the version we just heard how it's defined by the UN, to look at arms control, or more accurately at the erosion of arms control, which is a concern highlighted also in the report which we just heard about. The new START treaty, the last remaining nuclear arms control treaty between the US and Russia, will expire on February next year. And do you have any hopes for it to be extended, and what will happen afterwards? And I think this is important because the relationship has deteriorated, or at least become very unclear, so to say. So please share with us your insight.
Great, thank you. First of all, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. They've been very helpful. I've had some problems getting here from DC, so I just want to thank everybody for your assistance in that. And of course, it's great to be here and my colleagues who I've worked with for several years. So I guess the first thing I'll do is say a little about the concept of erosion of arms control. I know we hear that all the time. But I do want to emphasize that the norms that have been created because of treaties like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, Chemical Weapons Convention, Biological Weapons Convention, and other related treaties, the norms still exist. And it's certainly the case that we have had some serious challenges. And the geopolitical situation that has developed has also created challenges for what may happen in the future. You know, there have been problems, obviously, but the norms, they do exist, and that's why it's so important when something is violated, treaty is violated, that the international community really comes out and makes it known that that's a violation of the treaty, of a particular treaty. So for New START, as most of you probably know, the New START treaty between the U.S. and Russia expires next year in February. It had one extension potential, which we were able to do the first year of the Biden administration in 2022, when we came in. We were able to extend that. 2021. I'm getting my years confused. But it doesn't allow for any more extensions. At this point, if we don't have another treaty by February next year, it's over. And as you can imagine, we're not having any negotiations with Russia right now. We did have a number of meetings with Russia before they invaded Ukraine on a future treaty and a number of other issues we wanted to discuss with Russia. But when they invaded Ukraine, that pretty much ended. So nothing has been happening, and there were a number of things that we wanted on the table if we're going to have another treaty, which would probably take a lot longer than if we started right now. So that's where we are with the treaty itself. And it's the last treaty that we have with Russia that's a bilateral treaty. So there's a lot of reasons why we do want it to continue. One of the things that has been floating around is what we could do if there is no actual negotiations and no legal agreement to follow up on New START, is for the countries, which they could do, U.S. and Russia can say that, we are within the limits of the treaty, and we will continue to be within the limits of the treaty until we have another treaty. Now, keep in mind there were a couple of other problems. The treaty does provide that we're supposed to have inspections on each other's territory, and we are also supposed to have meetings twice a year. Those have not been happening, but both of our countries have been within the treaty limits. So even though there's been obviously breaches, there's been no material breach of the treaty, and we've been able to use national technical means to ensure we're still within the limits. Of course, inspections would be better. So last week, Russia, Putin did say that, I want to get the words right, they're prepared to continue adhering to the central numerical limits under the New START Treaty for 1 year after February 5th, 2026. What that would mean is the U.S. has not responded yet. We're hoping to get something very soon to this proposal. But if the U.S. would agree to that proposal, then that would mean the treaty would be able to continue for another year, which the idea is that we give it time at least to start negotiations. He also said, subsequently, based on an analysis of the situation, we will decide on whether to maintain these voluntary self-imposed restrictions. And the key words, of course, are the voluntary self-imposed restrictions. But it also highlights the fact that they will, look at the situation between now and then to see how things are going to decide if the voluntary commitment will continue. He also made it clear in his statement that in looking at the situation, they will also look at, and he highlighted, obviously the new missile defense system that the U.S. is proposing, and looking at that as a potential concern, to see what will happen with the U.S. proposal for a Golden Dome, which would be a system to allow for satellites and everything. It's basically a missile, like a serious strengthened missile defense system. Now, President Trump has also made statements about the New START Treaty. In July, he said that he would like to maintain the limits on deployed strategic nuclear weapons set out in the treaty after it expires. He said the New START Treaty is not an agreement you want expiring, and that removing the restriction would create a big problem. So theoretically, if that is the position of the president in the U.S., then theoretically they would come back with saying, okay, we agree to having a voluntary self-imposed restriction that will keep us within the numerical limits of the treaty. One of the other things to take into account is with the Trump administration, last time they were in office, they wanted to try to bring China into those discussions. So they would be more of a trilateral rather than a bilateral. China had expressed no interest in being part of that. I know that President Trump has also mentioned again that it would be, if possible, it would be good to have China at this discussion again, at a bilat, make it a trilat. Once again, China has expressed not an interest in doing it. Their perception is both of you countries have much more than we do at this point, so it doesn't, for them, make sense to be part of any kind of discussion. Russia has also been interested in bringing the UK and France into this, and the UK and France gave basically the same statement that China did, no interest at all. So theoretically, we'll see where this goes. Like I said, we're hoping to get something from President Trump and the U.S. In response to Putin's statement. I don't want to anticipate what it will be. I know there's a lot of things on the table, but not having a treaty I don't think is a good idea. It's been the way that the U.S. and Russia have been, U.S. and Soviet Union, now U.S. and Russia have been reducing our nuclear weapons. We have, for the U.S., for example, we have like 88% less nuclear weapons than we had at the end of the Cold War. So it's been very successful in getting to that point that's so important in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to reduce and going back to the word disarmament. So we'll see. That's where we are.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So you. I'm not a specialist on that topic, so allow me just one question so I can better. So it means that the arms control which had been agreed has been carried out, and now they want to remain at the levels of nuclear weapons they are having now. And the other countries say, well, we don't know how secure that situation is, so we don't want to participate in this control anymore, and maybe able to expand the nuclear arms we have under control?
Yeah, it's more, the response is we've had this START treaty for, it started with START and, has been going on for years with Russia, Soviet Union and Russia. So it's always been bilateral. So the idea was to bring in the Trump administration, because China's developing nuclear weapons, it's to somehow bring them in, more nuclear weapons, to bring them into the discussions. So China's response was not so much a criticism of the treaty as much as they don't feel like they should be in it. And same with Russia, same with France and the UK, because the US and Russia do have a lot. We do have a lot more weapons, and that's pretty much their saying.
Yeah. So still a lot to be worried for, actually. So for keeping insecurity with increased arms, maybe. But at the same time, we have also spoken about the need to have a nuclear deterrent Europe can rely on. So we are caught in a very difficult place there, between a rock and a hard place, we could say. So thank you. My next question goes to Professor Eunjung. And I would like to turn to the Asia-Pacific region. And two concrete regional examples that might also offer lessons for our own debates in Europe. So how can countries like South Korea and Japan balance their security needs with broader disarmament goals, especially given the presence of threat perceptions related to North Korea and to China's growing nuclear capabilities, as we also just heard from Ambassador Jenkins? Is there a discussion about broader understandings of security and a long-term peace policy vision, or is it not the moment for that?
Sure, good. Again, thank you so much for having me. This is a very educational opportunity for myself as well. I'm really, again, happy to be here. And thank you for asking that question, which is related to my region, again, the East Asia. And I was very carefully listening to, Under Secretary General Ms. Nakamitsu and Ambassador Jenkins wording too, and I was thinking about so-called BOP again. I'm a IR person, international relation researcher, and we have been, I'm here in the middle of Europe, and then out of all this, European historical context, IR theorists, they designed the concept of BOP. BOP is not, again, a just cliche, or I don't think it's out of date. It might be still the reality we might be looking for. What I'm trying to say is, in East Asia, we don't have really a balance. That's, I think, the fundamental problem. In Europe, of course, there are dozens of countries. More, some of you might be disagreed with my observation, but in some senses, Europe is fragmented, but in other senses, it is united. So, in that sense, geographically, geopolitically speaking, Europe is very much different from East Asia, I think. Again, in East Asia, we are, of course, connected but disconnected, especially by water. That's the fundamental difference between the Europe and then East Asia. Again, Japan is an archipelago. South Korea is a part of the continent, but de facto island country. We are disconnected from the continent. And then continental powers, again, China, Russia, North, they are connected physically too, and mentally too, probably. But anyhow, again, the China's stockpile, again, the nuclear warhead stockpile is growing. And as long as they don't feel they are safe enough, because the gap still between the Russian stockpile and between American stockpile and the Chinese stockpile, still there are a huge gap. So as long as there is a huge gap, Chinese will keep doing so. And there is no actually mechanism, unfortunately, legal or like a political or like even military, of course, no, mechanism to stop or to discourage that. So as long as, again, the China is, again, I'm not blaming China. I'm trying to, again, understand actually their calculation or their intention. So as long as they keep doing so, again, the South Korea and the Japan, we are, of course, the U.S. is a lie, and we are dependent on the U.S. providing the nuclear umbrella, which is the so-called extended deterrence. And that has been the mechanism for decades. But, well, now internally we face the challenge too. Here internally means, of course, American politics changed a lot, and domestically as well. Of course, even in Japan, of course, still we have a gap between the South Korean society and Japan. Of course, Japanese society as the only, victimized society by the nuclear bomb, they have much stronger allergic reaction to the nuclear endogenous, again, the nuclear weaponized weapon program. However, South Korea, as long as North is right there, again, the more and more people want to have our own nuclear weapon, even though not that many people really understand what does that mean, again, to the international global politics. So, and we do see the gap, again, between general public's perception and then so-called elite's perception. Again, among the experts, according to the CSIS public poll data, I think some of you already saw the data, but only not only probably 1/3 still, 1/3 of the experts support the nuclear weapon program, endogenous nuclear weapon program, whereas more than half are against, including myself. However, if you go to the general public's poll data, sometimes more than 70%, 70% of Korean public want to have our own. So I keep saying that that's not really a panacea for the peninsula's peace in the peninsula or for even our national security. But still, nuclear weapon is a strange weapon. Even though we don't use it, but still we want to have it. So that kind of, again, the mentality, I think, reflects all this imbalanced, situation. We are in a transitional stage. Transitional means very unstable. This is a volatile situation. So once we feel like we have now balance of threat or balance of challenge or balance of whatever, as long as we don't have it, I'm very sorry to say like this way, I feel very bad and sad. But I feel like it's going to be going on toward that direction. That's my concern, and that is why I think East Asian countries and European countries need to talk more to narrow the perception gap and to seek for the further cooperation. Let me just stop here for the first round.
Yeah, thank you. I think this also brings us back to this the different world we have now. And the Secretary General mentioned the multipolar world, and because my question to you actually, Eunjung, would be: is there a role for academia and for civil society organizations to influence this public perception? Because, of course, I mentioned the peace movement as we had it here in Germany, and but that was in a different situation of how power was divided across the world. So do you see an opportunity? Because I don't think you could learn from our historical experience, but maybe from how we deal with the fragile situation now. I'm not sure.
Well, you know, I truly enjoyed this full-day conference. I'm very much impressed by very attentive audience here in Berlin. But again, I do see pretty wide gap again between the intellectual group, so-called elites group, and the so-called general public. How to narrow down this perception gap is, I think this is our, again, really lifetime mission. Because I'm not, again, criticizing the general public's that perception, because they really scare. They're really scared. So so-called intellectual, we again have, I think, a responsibility to soothe their anxiety, not only just psychologically with the real things, or economically too. You know, all this AI, robotization, you know, automation, all the things are really threatening the existing jobs, especially in the developed world, because the income, the salary is high in the developed world. And so all these social, economic, and military challenges are really real things, again, to the people. And, you know, the intellectual people, we discussing, and again, I enjoy this discussion, but we're talking and we suggested something, but again, probably we need to really show. In that sense, I truly enjoyed the morning session and the second session as well. Again, we might have been something wrong again with the elites group. That's my the confession, actually. So yeah, that sense again, I feel like, you know, we need to really design some real actions and the real policy for the people. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I would like now to go on to Murithi Mutiga and to ask you to take us with you to debates around peace and security in Africa at the moment. We know that the European focus on the two large crises and conflicts we have close to us geographically, Ukraine and Gaza, overshadow the conflicts in Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And some of us have mentioned Sahel, I think, but and we are not actually aware of the horrendous humanitarian consequences these war situations actually have. So what is Africa's role in disarmament and security arrangements that work for people?
Yeah, no, thank you very much. And just to say that it's, you know, first of all, thank you very much for having me here. Really appreciate it. Very fascinating discussions. And I totally understand why some of those wars don't command enough attention. You know, Ukraine is in your neighborhood, as you mentioned. Gaza is such a moral calamity. The Palestinian issue really is a rallying cause for many decades. But when you look at the sheer numbers, when you look at the potential consequences, the situation in Sudan is really, really worrying. You know, the Horn of Africa it's not a stranger to conflict. If you look at many parameters, the number of peacekeepers, the number of displaced, it's long been a real hotspot. But Sudan is still unique in a disastrous way. A couple of points. One is that wars rarely break out in the region, in the capital. So the war in Sudan broke out in Khartoum, a city of nearly 10 million. It is the usual place of refuge. Usually wars are fought in the rural areas, and then people come to the capital. Now you have the capital turned into a war zone. So apart from the huge displacement, if you look at the figures, it's a country of maybe 50 million, 16 million internally displaced. 1 in 5, essentially. 4 million displaced, but displaced into extremely poor countries, you know, Chad, South Sudan. But then there's also a secondary issue with a war in the capital, which is that you suddenly lose your elite. Your economic elite, your political, cultural elite. Now the opposition politics in Sudan is a function of diaspora populations. And then the third thing is that rebuilding after the destruction of a capital is very, very difficult. We know this from Somalia, unfortunately. It's the last war in the region which broke out in the capital. And therefore, rebuilding the state is an extremely arduous and difficult task. Sadly, Sudan will redound much more than Somalia. It's a crossroads country between Muslim, Christian, Africa, between North and South. It abuts the Red Sea, and it will simply be the biggest state collapse if it proceeds in this direction in modern history. Double the size of Syria, you know, an extremely strategic crossroads. So bringing it to displacement, and then I'll come back to diplomacy, a couple of points. One is that what happens elsewhere doesn't stay elsewhere. It shapes events around the world. Now, suddenly, we are seeing strategic drones showing up in the Sudan conflict. Definitely lessons learned from, you know, the tragedy in Ukraine. And it's appending the logic of war. So, for example, you know, I work for the International Crisis Group, which focuses on conflict prevention. In March, the Sudanese armed forces, which is one of the belligerents, managed to push the rapid support forces out of the capital. Usually the capital is the big prize. You would imagine that then negotiations would have followed, and that's what we were propagating. But then what happened? The rapid support forces pulled back more than 2,000 kilometers, and then a couple of months later in May, they shot strategic drones very accurately into the wartime capital in Port Sudan. We've never seen anything like that in the region. Definitely lessons are being learned from elsewhere. Technology is being transferred, and that's really, you know, a point of concern. I think the second one is that the sophisticated new arms are bridging the gap between a state capacity and the capacity of non-state actors. The RSF is not completely a strictly non-state actor, but there's no question that the Sudanese armed forces are the formal institution of the state. But now, because of that level of technology, which also we saw in the war in Yemen, we are seeing an equalization between the state and non-state arms and non-state actors, which has the potential to prolong the war. I think that point is proliferation. And unfortunately for Africa, even when wars end elsewhere, it becomes a problem for the region. After the Cold War, a lot of Soviet arms and even Soviet personnel ended up in the wars on the continent. After the war in the Balkans, huge levels of proliferation, and again, a lot of weapons transfers to the continent. After the 9/11 wars, now we see that more than a third of jihadi deaths are still occurring on the continent when, you know, it used to be 1%. And after the war in Yemen, you know, some of the combatants are now actors in the Sudan war. So that's really potentially problematic. And then the final thing I'll say is that the degree of external involvement, partly because the US has retreated, and not just under Trump, but under successive, administrations. And that has created a bit of a free-for-all with various new actors trying to fill the gap and, in ways that can be quite damaging. So what can be done? I think that, I don't want to paint too bleak a picture. but really reviving. This is one of the few continents where multilateralism is not a dirty word, it's not a contested word, but African institutions really are not fit for purpose at the moment, particularly organizations like the African Union. Its member states haven't really given it the capacity to stand up to this very difficult moment. And so, you need much more investment in African diplomacy at a time when traditional actors, are in retreat or are in very, serious internal distress. I think that Europe needs to see itself as much more of a political actor, which is where I'll stop. What happens in Sudan rarely stays in Sudan. This is definitely Europe's neighborhood. It's next door. It is a Mediterranean issue. And I'll just give you one final anecdote, which is a bit depressing, but after the after the US pumped in a lot of weapons and money to the jihadis in Afghanistan to fight the Soviets, they then thought it was over. And they allowed, with Saudi Arabia essentially, bin Laden to move to Sudan. He lived a comfortable life there. They saw it essentially, and maybe I'm being unfair, but it was seen as much further away than the region, and especially, it was explicitly recorded that let's get him out of the region. He lived comfortably in Sudan and helped build the early Al-Qaeda there, staging its very first attacks in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam with a very feeble response from the West. And eventually 9/11 happened, partly because bin Laden was seen as somebody that had been cast far away. So I really think that what's happening in Sudan is something that can't be ignored, needs much more attention, as do the other conflicts in the region.
Thank you very much for enlightening us on the situation in Sudan, but also the proximity, and reminding us of the stay of Osama bin Laden there and the consequences it had. I think that we really are getting a much fuller picture now of what you call the multipolar world, and of how the different situations of stress and conflict are connected. Now, Mrs. Riegraf, you are responsible for the policy areas we're talking about here, and I would like to hear from you what the approach now is strategically, and what activities you can share with us here on to counteract these dangerous trends we heard from the UN report on increasing armament expenditure, but also the other information we got on ignoring crisis, which I also can understand. You have limited resources, but an ignored crisis, an ignored war will not be without consequences. So maybe I would be happy if you could share your insights. Thank you.
Does this work? Yeah, I think so. Thank you very much. And I really want to commend the Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung for putting together this panel this afternoon, because it's quite rare that we have a arms control and non-proliferation discussion which is truly global, and very often we speak amongst partners of the Euro-Atlantic Alliance, maybe together with Asia-Pacific. So I'm really thrilled by that, and I will try to respond as much as possible. You really made the world, the globe round today. Thank you. I think there are many points to depart, and I just maybe pick up the analysis put forward by Bonnie and Izumi, that obviously we are now more and more faced with a multipolar, not only environment, but also with a two-peer nuclear competition, with Russia and China being the main nuclear competitors of the United States. And at the same time, as I am representing Europe at this panel, I have to say, and I have to speak out on the security situation and the threats that Europe is faced with. So we are having this at least dual nuclear challenge while having to step up our own defense and deterrence in the face of a threat which is quite magnificent, which is quite dramatic. And I think those of you who live in Germany these days by now know exactly what I'm talking about. Drones, incursions, and most severely, obviously, the ongoing illegal war of aggression against Ukraine. So it is a necessity to step up our defense and deterrence to protect the citizens in Europe and also to show Russia the cost of what it's doing. But we have always been saying, and we have said that in the national security strategy as well, that strengthening our deterrence and defense can be complemented and must be complemented by an ongoing engagement into arms control and non-proliferation, and that is what we have been doing. To give you just a few examples, picking up on what my colleagues have been saying, in the nuclear area, we have now worked on reducing the risk of nuclear conflict for quite some time. And just next week, when I go to New York and hopefully see some of you again, we are launching a high-level, well, not high-level, but a signature event on reducing the risk of nuclear conflict, together with Sam Nunn, whom many in this room will probably know, who was responsible for that as a Democratic senator from the United States in earlier governments, where we will showcase many initiatives on reducing the risk of nuclear conflict to the audience, to the participants, because there are many who really work in various ways to do what is currently maybe the lowest hanging fruit, but the meaningful step that Izumi has also mentioned, which can be effectively implemented to make sure that a nuclear war, which can never be fought, which can never be won, is never fought, which is also the pledge by the P5 leaders. And you can do that through transparency, through communication, but also through enhancing and supporting dialogue on doctrines and better understanding of each other's intentions and plans shortly. Second, I checked when I came here. Last time I spoke on this distinguished panel is 7 years ago in a different position still. Then we spoke about the DPRK. A big part of my professional career was committed to Iran, to Iran's nuclear program. We yesterday saw the snapback of sanctions coming into effect. The JCPOA is no longer implemented as we speak. And non-proliferation is also a big part of our work, and I think this goes for many of my colleagues here, which we are continuing and which needs to be continued. There are new proliferation risks, both in the nuclear realm as well as related to a new interrelationship between artificial intelligence and weapons of mass destruction. Just to give you one example, one can use AI or quantum computing to produce ever more toxic biological weapons in an accelerated, in a very speedy way. And that's not a science which is privy to military or high-end universities. In the United States, it's possible to do that in a laboratory, say in Sudan, in some other countries. It can be used by terrorists as well. So fighting non-proliferation in all areas of weapons of mass destruction remains a key priority for us. And to give you a more positive example, we have also seen the change in Syria last year, which has opened up quite a window of opportunity to rid Syria of its chemical weapons heritage, which is enormous. unfortunately, this work has not really started yet, but the German government and I assume the office of Izumi, UNODA, and many other actors around the world stand ready to support Syria and the OPCW, which is the international organization which deals with chemical weapons, to get rid of this toxic chemical weapons heritage. And Germany, we have, you maybe don't know, but we have the Zentrum, we have the ZVBW, the Zentrum für Verifikationsaufgaben der Bundeswehr, who has the competent experts who could go, and we have the GECA, which is the National Society for Eliminating, for Destroying Chemical Weapons and Other Toxics, who could start this work, and the German government is really has already committed to finance it. Africa, I'm so glad that you spoke here, and I'm not an Africa expert, but Africa, but we are doing a lot of Africa, mostly in the area of small arms and light weapons. Africa is, of course, I think most of African countries have called themselves a nuclear weapon-free zone and are a nuclear weapon-free zone, but you have huge problems stemming from small arms and light weapons. And we have been engaging with various civil society organizations to demine, to register those weapons, to working together also with women from, mostly from Africa, the Balkans, and Latin America, to kind of formulate programs which take into account the special needs of women and vulnerable people when it comes to small arms and light weapons, because it's those parts of the populations who are mostly affected by the remnants of by these kind of remnants of war. As I have been saying, and I won't talk around it, we need to step up our defense and deterrence. And yes, our military expenditure is rising and needs to rise. And I think I've also looked at the report by the Secretary General and the numbers. What I have been seeing is clearly a rise, as you have been said, throughout the world. Strangely enough, Myanmar was taking the lead, but this has its, I think, own specific national explanation. But as for Europe, the rise is still less than, and the comparative percentage of military spending is still less than at the times of the Cold War. So numbers do explain something, but obviously they need to be taken, they need to be measured against the historical context. It's also, I think, a correlation, but not a causality, which is established here. So I think it was quite interesting that in your report you speak about why military spending does not guarantee security, rather than saying why. But you are not saying that military spending increases conflict or leads to conflict. So I think this is also an interesting part of the discussion, you know, of which we can have. It's always about correlations, but speaking about causality requires obviously a discussion with more factors. So I would recommend and encourage a discussion which differentiates between different kinds of weaponry, because I think the link between military spending and conflict when we talk about small arms and light weapons, for example, in Africa, is much clearer than, for example, in other areas. I want to make two last points which are really important to me. Germany, as you know, is very much committed to promoting norms and rules at the international level, and we have just had a very interesting week in New York during the high-level week, where I think we will all draw our conclusions from. And I absolutely agree in the power of international law, and also in its power in the power of setting norms. But there is another dimension to it, and this is that norms need to be complied with. And what we have been seeing, especially in Europe, but not only in Europe, is a large trend of non-compliance with international norms, particularly by Russia, who not only started the war of aggression, but suspended the implementation of the New START Treaty, as has been said, de-ratified the CTBT, withdraw from the milestone Conventional Arms Control Treaty for conventional arms in Europe, thwarted any progress in the Biological Weapons Convention, and this is not a comprehensive list, unfortunately, is using chemical weapons in its war of aggression against Ukraine, against the international taboo not to use chemical weapons. So I think in our aspire to promote norms, we collectively must also see to it that norms are being complied with. And that's also part of the work that we are doing. My last sentence, because everybody I think is keen to get into the discussion. So far, we have been relatively looking backwards, focusing at weaponry, at goods which are clearly military and which can be captured in military statistics or statistic on military spending. The future is where Izumi has said it's not going to be about weapons in the classical sense anymore. It will be about technologies which can be used either militarily or for civilian purposes, like, for example, quantum computing. And it will be ever more important to find new norms of behavior that set standards for behavior which prohibit or at least make unacceptable certain military uses. And so we will all also have to think about completely new forms of verification. And I think that's a big endeavor for the future where we are only beginning with. Thank you.
Thank you. And as time is running so quickly, I should have said a few minutes before, please think of your questions. Now I say it now, but I see some hands rising. So here vorne. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you very much. My question will be brief, and it's about the perception of China of what is happening in Ukraine, because we have Russia, which is a nuclear state, which is blackmailing a non-nuclear state for territorial gains. How does China see that or perceive that in the non-proliferation narrative?
We collect behind you.
I'm a member of Parliamentarians Against Nuclear Weapons since, I think, 30 years or longer. And I was part of the Women's Coalition around the United Nations organizing the UN Resolution 1325, which has its birthday this year of 25 years too. And I'm very proud of Böll Foundation, and thank you, Imme and others, of this combination of experts from the different regions and your knowledge and what you debated. Related to the problems and what you said last, Lady Riegraf, what will increase the problems with new technology. It seems so little what the resolution 1325 could achieve, but maybe you all could say something related to your work. How do you include parliamentarians and how do you include civil society, especially organized women's and maybe church groups? And if I may remark, because you related to the 80s too, Imme, so I was active these years, and I think sometimes our movements as well as our expertise has problems with memory because we are changing generations and changing governments and so on. There was a knowledge that the nuclear weapons would create climate change, horrible climate change. There was international knowledge in the 80s, but this knowledge is totally lost now, I have the feeling.
Thank you. We have 3 more questions, and I want to have them or I'm not sure whether we, here is, lift your hand again, yeah? So, Here in the third row, yeah.
Samai Salim, ich bin arbeitslos, an Ambassador Jenkins and Frau.
I'm jobless, sorry, Ambassador Jenkins, Miss Riegraf.
Obama, John Kerry, Germany, and 4 leading nations signed the Iran deal. Comes Bibi, wanted Bibi, comes to Washington, and with Trump they say, if you give me the deal, give me the shit, and they put it in the toilet. How do you react? Do you think anyone today respects Germany and the United States?
Thank you. And in the back, Anna.
Thank you very much. My name is Anna Schwarz. No, in English, okay. My name is Anna Schwarz. I'm working for the spokesperson on foreign policy of the Greens in the German Bundestag. And I was wondering, Mr. Mutiga, you said that like every conflict that ends somehow brings weapons and also fighters to Africa in one way or the other. And now we have, like, I think since decades, the highest number of conflicts and wars in the world. So from your perspective, how do we prevent this happening again?
And then here in the second row.
Thank you, Sebastian Niemetz from Icon, Germany. I have a question to Izumi Nakamitsu, or two, if I may. To mention one positive development, we have more states signing the treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons. We've now crossed the limit of half of the state parties of the UN, which is very interesting. Would you mind commenting on that? And also, I have a question. Next year will be the review conference of this treaty. Would you agree with me that it is a low-hanging fruit for the German government to participate at this treaty as an observer state in order to promote the norms and rules at the international level?
Thank you. And then we have one last question here, Laila.
Thank you, Leila Al-Zubaydi from the Heinrich-Böll Foundation. I would like to, maybe away from the technicalities, ask a little bit about narrative. I mean, on the one hand, we're trying to convince societies, also young people, that armament is necessary to protect Europe. On the other hand, I think they're a bit lost in terms of the power of the arms industry, arms exports that they can't really see the transparency in. They wonder why Germany is still delivering arms to Israel, why the US also, even under the Biden administration, has delivered arms to Israel, and so forth. And I feel like the whole narrative is not really is very difficult to follow. Let's put it that way. Let's put it in a polite way. And I wonder if how to actually communicate to society, also to young people, that armament is necessary, while at the same time there is a long-term vision for peace, a long-term vision for disarmament, and at the same time also having transparency about what is actually happening, not only with nuclear weapons, but also with conventional weapons. And also, I mean, Germany has a role to play in Sudan, I believe, and even if it doesn't actively support the warring factions, but also it could shut down on resources that they use to actually fund the war machinery and so forth. So I think this whole narrative of we uphold international law on the global level actually has to be made credible to people, and I don't feel it's there at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Laila. A very clear description of the demanding situation actually we are in. So I think there's a question for everyone on the panel. So Murithi, why don't you start?
Yeah, so just quickly, thanks for all those points. You know, I was reflecting a bit earlier that one thing that's often forgotten is that South Africa actually gave up nuclear weapons after apartheid. And there's no real appetite on the continent now for a new nuclear weapons race. But I have to tell you, there's a discourse about arguing that maybe it wasn't wise, you know, to give up the weapons in a world that has become so disorderly. And the unfortunate example that's often cited is Libya. Of course, I know Ukraine as well is a very prominent example, but very often, you know, there's that discourse underneath the parapet which argues that, you know, it's a very disorderly world. Fortunately, there isn't a nuclear arms race, but I have to point out that current. Very quickly, you know, there's no question about this correlation between the weaponry pouring into the continent and you know, the deaths and conflict that occur. I'll give you a small example, which is Ethiopia and Somalia. They were almost ground zero at a time when the US and the Soviets didn't want to confront each other directly. You know, George Kennan, the great theorist, said that detente died in the sands of the Ogaden, which was that, you know, the Soviets backed Ethiopia heavily. Initially, the Americans backed Ethiopia, and then the Americans backed Somalia. And the result was an endless supply of small arms. And it's no coincidence that the Horn of Africa remains so fundamentally troubled, even though a lot of the dynamics are primarily local. But that flow of arms, you know, doesn't help. So what I would argue is, I think prevention before the conflict starts is really crucial, because the theater is just seen as strategic. It's right next to the Red Sea, you know, very important waterways, and inevitably external actors will back one party or the other. So preventing the conflicts from starting is really important. And for example, now Ethiopia, Eritrea, the tensions are really high. I think you need preventive diplomacy, because once it begins, for sure, especially the rival Gulf powers will pick sides and engage in heavy, you know, backing of either side. And we have to note that actually interstate conflict has become very rare on the continent. So really rowing back and maintaining that stance, also continuing the diplomacy, very heavily driven by Qatar, especially between the DRC and Rwanda, is really important. I'll very quickly, I know that we are running out of time, but you know, when Somalia collapsed, for example, I'm from Kenya, it was very rare to have armed robberies. But because the country was awash in arms, when the country collapsed, then weaponry swept also into Kenya, which used to be, you know, very secure, you know, still relatively is, but I've experienced it in my own lifetime. And then finally on Germany and the Red Sea, I think for sure, you know, it's a strategic imperative. It's really criminal not to engage, because this is an area, if you're looking just at interest, 20% of the imports for Europe pass through the Red Sea. And so not engaging is really neglectful and strategically unwise. And particularly, I think, you know, the area had been left to the Americans. The Americans have left for good, and Europe has to step up, among others.
Thank you. Eunjung.
Again, thank you for the interesting question. Rather than just, you know, rather than just answering to a specific question, let me just, you know, share my kind of, you know, concluding remark again, because, you know, we are running out of time. So again, HBS rightly, I think, chose the key word, again, the peace, security, and freedom. And all day today, I mean, I was thinking about these three concepts or value is in a kind of trilemma situation, sadly. We want a security, but for security, we might need to sacrifice peace. And for peace, we might need to sacrifice our security again. And for the freedom, again, we might need to sacrifice the security again. I mean, this is like, again, the trilemma, maybe it's a trap-like situation. So which one really should be the top priority? Again, of course, freedom in the longer term, and peace, of course, in a more positive sense, not just negative sense, just not beyond the absence of war. Of course, we need a more positive sense of peace, and we want freedom. But so far, unfortunately, we live in this, again, the era of, again, the survival. And that's where, again, I think a concern, not only from all these military conflicts, or from all this cyber or many other different so-called new emerging security concerns as well. So, well, I really don't have a clear answer how to, solve this trilemma situations, because we, liberal democratic society, we want to just, protect and defend this regime. But in order to do so, again, as I said, we might need to sacrifice our freedom up to a certain level. That's really these days my big question mark, until up to what extent are we willing to? Again, it's go to your paradoxical situation. You pointed out the paradoxical situation. South Korea, we always talk about the peace, but we sell the all the arms to the other countries, and which is actually beneficial for the GDP. And the stock prices goes up, and some people are very happy with that too, and even proud of that too. And I'm in a kind of very mixed feeling. In some senses it's a proud thing, but in other senses it's a sad thing. So again, for now, I don't have a really clear answer. I think we need to probably keep just this conversation go on to solve this trilemma question. Thank you.
Thank you. Susanne Riegraf, questions for you on how to include civil society and parliament and women.
Yes, thank you for that question. And I think that's something that we have always been doing. We have always civil society representatives embedded in our delegations to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, to give you just an example. And especially when it comes to the dialogue on lethal autonomous weapon systems or modern technologies, I think we wouldn't even be capable of formulating informed positions without a very close dialogue with science, but also scientific civil society on the way, because these new weapon systems pose really complex technological but also ethical, philosophical questions, which you need to be reflecting very thoroughly before you go to negotiate on these weapons. I also wanted to respond to the question raised on China-Russia's relationship, which is actually a very pertinent one, as those two countries don't act as much in synergy as one would think from the outside. We personally think that China is still much more keen on preserving the system, or preserving in order, and still much more thinks that it can draw benefits from the existing order, including the Non-Proliferation Treaty, whereas Russia basically dismantles and uses its dismantling of the architecture to achieve political gains. But they are not showing these divergences openly. Most of the time this happens behind closed doors. But if you look very thoroughly at what the various representatives are seeing, you can see clear differences, and that's obviously a point of departure for a strategic discussion. And I wanted to just quickly dwell on what my colleague has said, because I think it was a very important point for the German government, for this German government. but for all German governments, I would say it cannot be about abandoning freedom. I think we are clearly in a situation in Europe where we realize there cannot be peace if my neighbor is under attack. So it's more about security, and peace is probably, I mean, it's always a definition, but maybe something more for the longer term. But we are also very clear that while protecting our security, we are not giving up on freedom, we are not giving up on the rule of law, on the civil and political rights guaranteed to our citizens, and that is what I think what distinguishes European countries from the autocracies out there, and which absolutely needs to remain the difference. Thanks.
Izumi.
I will start with where you left. Absolutely, we cannot give up on any of those things. We cannot give up. By the way, that was the final words. He said it several times. Secretary General's this year's General Assembly High-Level Week speech. We will not give up. We cannot give up. A couple of questions. I can question on TPNW. Sure. For your information, I encourage all governments to come and participate as observers, the review conference and states MSP, meeting of states parties, including nuclear weapon states. I think as a matter of principle, if you have issues, problems with a certain treaty, or for that matter, for anything, but you're invited to participate, you should be able to actually state your position. So I would not give you the reactions, but I have encouraged all P5. The conference is open to you. I know you have a problem with that conference. Come and talk to them directly. Why do I say that? Because that is the beginning of the dialogue, which goes for this narrative issue as well. I believe that we cannot cut off dialogues and conversations. Actually, I would even say that in a time of crisis, extreme tensions, difficulties, we need to speak to, and then at the UN, I don't use this word, adversaries. You need to speak to anyone. If you actually stop talking to them, then you would not make any progress. So in that spirit, I want to actually remind ourselves that during the previous Cold War, this region, Europe, had a wealth of experience, starting the Helsinki process, articulated a lot of confidence building, military confidence building, transparency measures, which were indeed very useful in ending the Cold War. Another stark example, 1962, Cuban Missile Crisis, that was probably as close as we, the human community, went to total nuclear war. After that, President Kennedy and General Secretary Khrushchev realized how dangerous the world had gone to. So they opened direct dialogue, tried to build confidence, and came up with a partial nuclear test ban treaty in less than a year. So I would call it a leadership responsibility. In a time of crisis and tension, you need to talk. You have to find channels. I'm not just talking about government to government, wide-ranging various channels of communications to try and find a way out. I think it is really a mistake to make visa applications more difficult for certain nationalities when we need to speak and reach out to young people from certain nationalities. So the UN believes in dialogue. We know it's not easy. In fact, it is very difficult. I maintain dialogue, a close working relationship with all countries. I tell them, the Secretary General tell them directly, about the illegality of Ukraine invasion to our counterparts directly. But that is beginning of a conversation and dialogue, and disarmament efforts always have to start from there. Dialogue, confidence building, discussions, so don't close the channels. League of Nations failed to prevent World War II. We cannot have the current environment to lead to a total failure, and that's why we should not give up. We need to find, this is like a very complex jigsaw puzzle. There are many different thousands of pieces. We have to make sure that those pieces will fit into the right place to find a way out. And that's what one of the responsibilities of multilateral platform. It is called diplomacy. So there are many other things that I want to say, but that's it. Civil society, young people also participating more deeply in the norms in the future when everything will change with the technologies. That's another part. Don't leave it to your government only. Everyone has to actually think about those issues, build expertise and capacities to engage in informed conversations so that you would not be fooled by a whole bunch of disinformation that is out there in social media. So it's a very difficult endeavor, but we cannot give up.
Thank you. Now, Bobby.
Okay, everyone's pretty much said a lot of what I was going to say, which is good because we're certainly running out of time. I'll just start with the civil society, just to reiterate what my colleagues have said. I mean, in the U.S., we have a very strong civil society participation in a number of things. And so we want to continue to, obviously want to continue to have that. I started at NGO, I've worked at NGOs, so I highly respect the input of NGOs to be part of discussions, but also to push the government. So I've been on the other side, and I realize the importance that civil society has in developing policies. That's something we should definitely continue. On the China issue, I know when Russia was threatening to use weapons, nuclear weapons, I believe that China was also extremely concerned about that and pushing back against that. So, as Susanne said, you know, they have their own issues and their own relationships, not as close as we would think it is. But I know in the terms of the situation with Russia and Ukraine and nuclear weapons, no one really wants Russia to be using nuclear weapons. I wasn't sure I got everything because I was putting this on and off on your question on the JCPOA. But I think you're asking about withdrawal from the JCPOA? Is that the question? Because of that? Because of... Okay. Well, I don't know. Yeah. So on the question of the narrative on international law, my background is international law, and that's what I actually teach international law. I've actually gone back to get my PhD in international law, so I very much believe in international law. And you know, what you tell young people, you know, if you step back and, you know, for me, you know, weapons are for deterrence and defense. And that's pretty much, you know, we have a life of arms control and non-proliferation. You're always talking about reducing and getting rid of weapons. And so for me, the real use of weapons is for deterrence and defense, and only to be used as a last resort when diplomacy has failed. And I would really focus on that. And, you know, history has a lot of messy things that happened, bad decisions that were made. But the important thing for each generation is to understand that we have to focus on international law, multilateralism, and diplomacy to try to resolve conflicts before they get to the point where they do end up being a war. And would hope that the next generation of the world will actually understand that better than past generations have or current generations have.
Yeah. So it's very difficult to close this conference now because I think each panel has brought us into a different world and into shown different dimensions and facets to, and it's very difficult to really put them all together and have a comprehensive picture now, which tells us exactly what to do. And because you now finished by saying diplomacy actually shouldn't end. That's also what you said. And at the same time, this need for increasing capacities for defense is different from diplomacy. So maybe we could say we always need to add diplomacy to all efforts we make for improving security, and being clear that improving security is not equal to peace, because peace has many more dimensions to it. It's about the quality of how a society lives within, respects the diversity and justice and different perspectives on what a good life is, and at the same time among societies, and at the same time keeping a clear eye on forthcoming risks associated to not controlling proliferation, of not being aware in time of potential conflicts and what you can do against them, but also including the very dangerous possibilities of technological development and combination of different technologies, as we have heard from all of you. And also to keep in mind the toll unchecked and unmoderated developments have on our use of nature. And I think that's why I say use of nature and not relationship to nature, because using it means not respecting it. That's what I try to say with this. So thank you all for having stayed with us. I think the concentration was very strong in the room. And I think the combination of these panels really show what a comprehensive perspective requires. So thank you very much, Vera and Philip, for organizing this. And and most of the points you had told me I should mention, you mentioned also, thank you very much for mentioning previously, but I would again invite you all to have a look, mark in your calendars the conference we are having already in a few months on the 30th of January, and enjoy your evening. Thank you.